In this lesson, we will learn how contrast as a principle of composition not only relates to the way that colors and values interact, but also how contrast is an important part of maintaining interesting animations. Okay, so just to get an idea of what we're talking about when we say contrast. Contrast is created by using elements that conflict with one another. Now, often contrast is created using complementary colors or extremely light and dark values. And contrast creates interest in a piece that often draws your eye to certain areas. And it's really just used to make an image more visually appealing. So in this particular example that you're seeing here, this is one of the most common things that you think of when contrast. A lot of time when we talk about contrast, people are just referring to the light and dark, even though it can mean a lot more things than just that. So kind of as I scrub forward here, you'll notice that the shot kind of starts out where it feels a little bit contrasty because we have all of these lights over here on the right, but then it becomes a lot more contrasted once we move to the end of our timeline and we have this element here on the right. Now we have really a lot of elements that are contrasting besides just the color in this animation. We have these spinning circles, but then we also have this straight line. So there's contrast in our shapes as well as our values. Now, one of the things I want to point out with this particular composition here is that it is using the rule of thirds. So let's talk about what that means. And I'm going to go ahead and turn on my guides so that you can see these rulers that I have here. So an image should be imagined as divided into 9 equal parts by 2 equally spaced horizontal and 2 equally spaced vertical lines. So when we're talking about the rule of thirds, you're using a grid that looks like this over the top of your image. So things that are important compositional elements should be placed along these lines or their intersections. So you can clearly see that this element that we have here on the right is placed all along the intersections and really this vertical line that you see here. So most of this area of our composition is taken up here on the right. And then this area here on the left feels a lot more just like negative space. So whenever you are using this rule of thirds, it usually provides more visual interest than just placing images smack in the middle. Now, earlier we talked about the balance of a composition and how you can just put 2 elements side by side or even just one element and it has that symmetry. So it doesn't always mean that if you're using the rule of thirds, your composition is going to be the most interesting thing it could ever be, or that if you're using something really symmetrical that it's going to be boring. In fact, sometimes, and especially in motion design, putting things right in the middle of the composition can be more appealing simply because too many elements can begin to put a viewer into sensory overload. So just take it with a grain of salt whenever you think about using the rule of thirds. Is it the best thing for your shot? Sometimes it can be, and sometimes it actually might feel off balance to be using it. In this particular situation, I feel like it works really nicely just because of the elements that we're using here. So let's also talk about contrast with our animation. So I'm going to move over here to our second example. So double click that composition. And I'm just going to scrub through here and talk a little bit about the contrast we have going on in this comp. Now, obviously, you have a lot of contrast with the colors, but we talked about that a little bit in our last example. So in this example, I want to focus on the contrast in the animations. So we have things moving up and down, side to side, and then we also have differences in our speed. So the elements we have moving here in the back feel like they're moving kind of at a medium speed, and then this tablet pops up pretty quickly and then slowly kind of recedes to that background. And so we get a lot of push and pull in this kind of animation. And this is something that your animations can really obviously lack, but when it's there, it can just really feel like, oh, it's supposed to be there, and maybe you don't notice it as much. But it's definitely one of those things that can push your animation to feel a lot more polished in the end. So adding contrast between your animations as far as the speed and really just what you're animating on screen can really add a lot of visual interest to your compositions. So I also want to talk about contrast to make text readable. So let's move over here to our third example of contrast. So obviously right here, we just kind of have an example of what contrast is laid out here for us in our text, but the colors that we're using are about as far away from contrasting as you can get. So this gray that you see here is very, very similar in value to this purpley blue color we have here as our background. So sometimes whenever you're choosing colors for something you're going to create, you might get caught up in, okay, I really want to use a gray, or I really also want to use this purple. And then once you're choosing from maybe some swatches that you've laid out, you don't put as much thought into, is this going to be readable, or is there going to be enough contrast there to make this text readable on my background? And in this case, the answer is definitely no. So if you just come in here and we grab our text, I'm going to go ahead and open up the text panel so that I can change that color. So come up there and click character. That'll open that up for you. If we just click this piece of text and then grab our color, text color here, we obviously have this really middle of the range gray here. And simply by pushing that more to white or more down towards the black, we automatically get a much more contrasty composition simply by choosing a less middle of the road value. Now, if we had a really light background and our text was white, that still wouldn't be enough contrast for us. So whenever you're picking your colors initially, put this into consideration, just that you want to have colors that are going to be easier to read, because your main goal is to have this message read. So if you're choosing colors that don't have enough contrast, the message isn't going to be read, and you really haven't solved the problem that you set out to do as a designer, was to communicate, in this case, the definition of contrast. So this is just up here so that you can see that. So in this lesson, we learned that you really cannot create readable motion design without contrast, and that it's one of the most significant elements of creating clear communication of our message.